Marcus Whitfield spent 14 years learning how to spot a lie inside a spreadsheet. As Vice President of Risk Compliance at Ashford National Bank, his entire career was built on a simple premise: money tells the truth, even when people don't. Transactions leave trails. Patterns repeat. And anyone trying to hide something eventually makes a mistake small enough to miss and large enough to matter. Marcus had caught dozens of those mistakes over the years: small business owners skimming cash, mid-level executives moving funds offshore, a car dealership that turned out to be a front for something much uglier. He was good at his job. He was proud of being good at his job. What he never once considered, in 14 years of reading other people's secrets and rows of numbers, was that one day the numbers would lead him home. It started on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, the kind of ordinary day compliance officers live for, because ordinary days mean nothing is on fire. Marcus was running a routine audit on a cluster of commercial accounts flagged by the bank's automated monitoring system. Nothing urgent, just a batch of transactions that had triggered a threshold review. He expected to close the file by lunch. Instead, one account number stopped him cold. It belonged to Whitfield Import and Trade, a modest logistics company that had been in his family for 11 years. His younger brother Daniel ran it. Marcus had helped Daniel open the original business account himself, back when it was 3 employees and a rented warehouse. Seeing the name on a flagged list felt less like a red flag and more like a typo. He almost dismissed it. Almost. But the numbers didn't behave like a typo. Whitfield Import and Trade had processed just over $400,000 in wire transfers over the previous 6 weeks, routed through 3 intermediary accounts before landing in Daniel's business checking. The invoices attached to the transfers described shipments of industrial packaging materials, cardboard, pallets, shrink wrap, the unglamorous backbone of a small logistics company. Except the dollar amounts didn't match anything close to that kind of freight. A single invoice claimed $42,000 for shrink wrap. Marcus had audited enough freight companies to know that number was absurd on its face. Either his brother had discovered the most expensive shrink wrap in North America, or the invoices existed for a reason that had nothing to do with packaging at all. He told himself there was an explanation. There's always an explanation, he thought, because that's the sentence compliance officers repeat to themselves right up until the moment there isn't one. He pulled the account history further back, past the 6-week flag window, into the full year. The pattern didn't start recently. It had been building steadily for over a year, small at first, deposits under the $10,000 reporting threshold, spaced out just far enough to avoid triggering automatic review. Structuring. It was one of the oldest tricks in financial crime, the deliberate breaking of large sums into smaller pieces to stay under the radar. Marcus had taught younger analysts how to detect exactly this pattern. He had built training modules on it. And now he was staring at it in his own brother's business account, dated back 14 months. He closed his laptop and sat in his office for a long time without moving. The building around him kept running the way it always did, phones ringing 2 cubicles over, the low hum of the HVAC system, someone laughing near the break room. None of it touched him. He kept thinking about the word structuring, how clinical it sounded in a training manual and how different it felt when the name attached to the account was his brother's. He thought about family dinners, about Daniel's kids calling him Uncle Marcus, about the loan Marcus had personally recommended approving 3 years earlier when Daniel needed capital to expand the warehouse. He had vouched for his brother. He had put his own professional credibility behind him. If this was what he suspected it was, Marcus hadn't just missed a crime. He had helped build the door it walked through. He didn't sleep that night. He ran the numbers again at his kitchen table, hoping exhaustion had made him misread something. It hadn't. If anything, a second look made the picture worse. The intermediary accounts the money passed through belonged to 2 companies Marcus had never heard of, both registered in a neighboring state, both formed within the same 3-month window 18 months earlier. He searched the names. One shared a registered agent address with a company his father, Walter Whitfield, had used decades earlier for an entirely different business. It wasn't proof of anything by itself. Company formation agents get reused all the time. But paired with everything else, it planted a question Marcus couldn't unplant: Was this Daniel acting alone, or was this something the whole family had built together, one generation passing the architecture to the next? Walter Whitfield had built the family's first business from nothing, a scrap metal yard that grew into a modest trucking operation by the time Marcus was in high school. Walter was the kind of man who measured success in cash flow and control, who trusted banks the way he trusted weather forecasts, useful, but not something you built your life around. Marcus had gone into banking partly to prove something to his father, to show that there was a version of success built on transparency and rules rather than instinct and shortcuts. For years, that felt like a settled argument, one Marcus had quietly won just by building a stable, respected career. Now, sitting with the account records at 2 a.m, he wondered if the argument had never actually ended. Maybe his father had just moved it somewhere Marcus wasn't looking. By the end of the week, Marcus had built what he would later describe, in the driest possible terms, as an unofficial file. Officially, he hadn't escalated anything yet. Every instinct trained into him over 14 years said the moment a suspicious activity report gets filed, the process takes over: compliance, legal, potentially federal regulators, a chain of events no individual employee controls once it starts moving. He knew that filing the report was not optional. Federal law requires it. Willful failure to report known laundering activity isn't just a professional risk, it's a felony exposure for the officer who sits on it. Marcus knew the statute number without having to look it up. He had cited it to other employees a dozen times. He had never imagined reciting it to himself about his own family. He decided to talk to Daniel first, not to warn him, he told himself, but to understand. He drove to the warehouse on a Saturday morning, telling his wife he needed to check on some equipment for the business, which was technically true and completely misleading. Daniel greeted him the way he always did, easy and unguarded, showing him a new loading dock configuration before Marcus had said a word about why he'd come. Marcus watched his brother's hands as he talked, steady, unbothered, a man who clearly believed he had nothing to hide, or a man who had gotten very good at appearing that way. Marcus asked, as casually as he could manage, how the shrink wrap contracts had been going. Daniel didn't blink. He said business had been great, actually. Growing every month. Marcus asked to see the warehouse's actual packaging inventory, framing it as professional curiosity, something he was writing up for the bank's small business lending team. Daniel walked him through the floor without hesitation. There were pallets, cardboard, shrink wrap, a completely normal, completely modest amount for a company their size. Nowhere close to justifying $42,000 in a single invoice. Standing in that warehouse, watching his brother lie without appearing to lie at all, Marcus understood two things at once. First, that Daniel almost certainly knew exactly what the invoices really represented. Second, that his brother had either learned to compartmentalize with frightening skill, or someone else had coached him on exactly what to say if a question like this ever came up. Neither possibility made Marcus feel better. That night, Marcus sat across the dinner table from his father for the first time since finding the account. Walter talked about the weather, about a Cardinals game, about a fishing trip he wanted to take before winter. Marcus watched him the way he'd learned to watch flagged accounts, not for what was said, but for what didn't add up. At one point Walter mentioned, almost in passing, that Daniel's business had really turned a corner this year, that he was proud of how far his son had come. It was an ordinary, fatherly comment. But something about the phrasing, "turned a corner," this year matched the timeline on the account almost exactly. Marcus didn't say anything. He excused himself early, claiming a headache, and sat in his car outside his parents' house for 20 minutes before he trusted himself to drive. Over the following 2 weeks, Marcus lived two separate lives that refused to stay separate. At the bank, he was still vice president of risk compliance, still expected to review flagged accounts, approve reports, sign off on the ordinary business of catching other people's crimes. At home, he became something closer to an investigator working a case where every witness shared his last name. He requested access to a broader transaction history under the pretense of a department-wide audit, careful to route the request through channels that wouldn't single out his interest in one specific account. What he found didn't just confirm structuring. It revealed a second business, a consulting firm registered to an address Marcus recognized as his parents' old lake house, one that had supposedly been sold 6 years earlier and, according to public records, technically still was. The consulting firm had no employees Marcus could find, no online presence, no clients he could trace through any conventional search. It existed almost entirely as a name on paperwork, a vessel for invoices between Whitfield Import and Trade and the two intermediary companies he'd flagged earlier. Money moved into the consulting firm from Daniel's business, then out again to accounts Marcus couldn't fully trace without triggering internal alerts he wasn't ready to explain. It was elegant, in the way these things sometimes are, not sophisticated enough to fool a forensic accountant for long, but more than sophisticated enough to sail past a distracted regulator or an inexperienced compliance officer glancing at a monthly summary. Someone had built this carefully. Someone had thought about layers. Marcus didn't yet know who, precisely, but he knew it wasn't Daniel's idea alone. The uncomfortable truth compliance officers rarely say out loud is that most laundering schemes aren't undone by brilliant detective work. They're undone by boredom, or greed, or a family member who gets sloppy because they've never been caught before. Marcus began to suspect that was exactly what had happened here, a scheme that started small, worked, and grew overconfident with each success. 14 months of undetected structuring will do that to people. It teaches them, wrongly, that they've found something the system can't see. What they usually find is a system that hasn't been asked to look yet. Marcus was now the person being asked to look, and every part of his professional identity told him that looking meant reporting. Every part of the rest of him wasn't ready to hear that yet. He tried, briefly, to imagine a version of this where he simply said nothing. He was good at his job specifically because he understood how thoroughly financial trails get buried when institutions want them buried. He could, theoretically, quietly steer future audits away from these account numbers. He could tell himself it wasn't his job to police his own family, that the bank had other compliance officers, that eventually someone else would catch it if it was real. He sat with that idea for exactly one evening. It didn't survive the night. Marcus understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent 14 years enforcing rules on strangers, that the only thing worse than reporting his family would be becoming, quietly and permanently, one more person who let it happen because it was easier not to look. He requested a private meeting with the bank's chief compliance officer, a woman named Renata Cole who had mentored Marcus early in his career and trusted him more than almost anyone else in the building. He told her everything, not as an accusation, but as a disclosure, the way federal guidelines require an employee to declare a conflict of interest the moment they discover one. Renata listened without interrupting him once. When he finished, she didn't offer sympathy first. She offered process, which Marcus later realized was its own form of respect. She treated him like a professional capable of handling the truth, not like a man who needed to be handled. The bank would need to file a suspicious activity report. Marcus would be recused from any involvement in the investigation, effective immediately, given the obvious conflict. The report was filed on a Thursday morning in November, almost 2 months after Marcus first opened that flagged account file expecting nothing more than an ordinary Tuesday. Filing it didn't feel like the relief he'd hoped for. It felt like pulling a single thread in hearing, somewhere deep inside a structure he couldn't see, the first sound of something shifting under its own weight. Federal investigators don't move quickly, not in cases like this. There would be weeks, possibly months, before anyone outside the bank and a small circle of regulators knew an inquiry had even started. Marcus went home that night and didn't tell his wife the specifics, only that something had happened at work that he couldn't discuss yet. She didn't push. She had learned, over their marriage, when to give him room. Daniel called him 4 days later, his voice tight in a way Marcus had never heard from his easygoing younger brother. He said the bank had frozen 2 of his accounts pending review, that he didn't understand what was happening, that he needed Marcus to look into it, to use his position to help. It was, Marcus realized, the first time in 14 months that Daniel had directly asked him for anything related to the business. He listened to his brother's voice crack slightly on the phone and felt something crack slightly in himself too. He told Daniel he couldn't help, not wouldn't, he was careful to say, but couldn't, that he had a legal obligation that had nothing to do with loyalty and everything to do with what he already knew. There was a long silence on the line. Then Daniel asked one question: how long had Marcus known? Marcus didn't lie. He told him the truth, 2 months, since a routine audit had flagged the account by accident. Daniel's voice changed again, not soft this time, but sharp, almost accusatory, as if the discovery itself were the betrayal rather than whatever had caused it. He said their father would want to know Marcus had sat on this for 2 months before doing anything. Marcus asked, as calmly as he could manage, whether their father already knew what the accounts had been used for. The silence that followed answered the question more completely than any words could have. Daniel hung up without saying goodbye. Marcus sat holding the phone for a long time afterward, understanding that whatever this family had been before that Tuesday in September, it was never going to be quite that same thing again. The investigation, once it formally began, moved through the family with the patience of water finding cracks in a foundation. Federal agents interviewed Daniel first, then requested records from the 2 intermediary companies, then, 6 weeks later, contacted Walter Whitfield directly. Marcus learned about each step secondhand, through the careful, limited channel Renata maintained with him, enough to know the process was continuing, not enough to compromise the case or his own position. He learned that the consulting firm registered to his parents' old lake house wasn't a coincidence at all. Walter had never actually sold the property, he had transferred it to a trust years earlier, a trust investigators believed had been used to obscure ownership specifically so it could later serve exactly this purpose. His father hadn't just known. His father had built the first version of the structure himself, long before Daniel ever ran a shrink-wrap invoice through it. There is a particular kind of grief that has no ceremony attached to it, no funeral, no framework anyone teaches you how to survive. Marcus experienced something like that in the weeks after learning the full scope of his father's involvement. It wasn't just the discovery of a crime. It was the slow, unwelcome realization that the version of his father he'd built his entire adult life in relation to, the tough, self-made businessman who trusted instinct over institutions, had, at some point, decided that trusting instinct meant trusting himself more than the law. Marcus had spent his career believing he'd chosen a different path than his father, a cleaner one. Now it looked less like 2 different paths and more like one path his father had simply walked further down, quietly, while Marcus wasn't looking closely enough to notice where it led. The money itself, once fully traced, wasn't connected to anything as dramatic as cartels or organized crime syndicates, which almost made it harder to process rather than easier. It came from a series of undisclosed cash businesses Walter had run on the side for over a decade, unlicensed lending, informal collection services for other business owners who didn't want to deal with courts, activity that generated real income but none of it clean enough to deposit directly. Daniel's logistics company became the laundering mechanism almost by accident of proximity, a legitimate business Walter trusted enough to route dirty income through until it came out the other side looking like ordinary commerce. It wasn't a criminal empire. It was something smaller and, in its own way, sadder, a family patriarch who had built one legitimate business and one illegitimate one side by side for years, and eventually needed the legitimate one to launder the other. Marcus was never criminally implicated. His disclosure to Renata Cole, made the moment he understood what he was looking at, protected him under the very laws he'd spent his career enforcing. But protection under the law and protection from consequence are 2 very different things. He kept his job. He kept his reputation within the industry, which, if anything, grew stronger. Colleagues who learned what he'd done, quietly, respected the impossible position he'd been placed in and the choice he'd made inside it. What he didn't keep was his family, not in the shape it used to have. Daniel took a plea agreement 8 months later, cooperating with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, a decision that fractured his relationship with Walter almost as completely as it fractured Walter's relationship with Marcus. Walter Whitfield was indicted the following spring on charges of money laundering and structuring financial transactions to evade reporting requirements. Marcus did not attend the arraignment. He told himself it wasn't out of anger, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. It was closer to an inability to reconcile the 2 images he now carried of his father, the man who taught him to fish, who sat in the stands at every high school basketball game, who once drove 6 hours overnight because Marcus's car broke down during a college trip home, and the man federal prosecutors described in court filings as the architect of a laundering scheme that ran, in one form or another, for over a decade. Both men were real. Marcus had simply never been given the chance to know they were the same person until the numbers forced him to. The case became, briefly, a regional news story, a compliance officer who uncovered his own family's laundering scheme, praised by prosecutors for professional integrity under circumstances most people are never tested by. Marcus didn't do interviews. He didn't want the story to become something people admired from a safe distance, a tidy narrative about doing the right thing. It wasn't tidy. It cost him a father he no longer spoke to, a brother who blamed him more than he blamed himself, and a version of his own family history he could never fully trust again. Doing the right thing, in Marcus's experience, didn't come with the relief people assumed it would. It came with a very specific, very quiet kind of loneliness that no verdict, however just, was ever going to fully resolve. What stayed with Marcus longest wasn't the investigation, or the courtroom, or even the final sentencing hearings that closed the case nearly 2 years after that ordinary Tuesday in September. What stayed with him was a smaller memory, one he returned to more often than he expected. It was from that Saturday morning at the warehouse, watching Daniel walk him through stacks of ordinary cardboard and shrink wrap with complete, practiced ease. Marcus kept thinking about how convincing his brother had been, how naturally the lie had come, and what that meant about how long Daniel must have been rehearsing it, even just in his own head, waiting for someone to finally ask. He came to believe, over time, that the real danger in his family had never been the money itself. Money is just paper and numbers, indifferent to what it's used for. The real danger was the quiet agreement, made somewhere without ever being spoken aloud, that certain questions simply wouldn't be asked inside the family, that loyalty meant not looking too closely at where prosperity came from. Marcus had broken that agreement not because he was braver than everyone else, but because his job had trained him to notice what other people had trained themselves not to see. He often wondered what would have happened if he'd worked in any other field, if the numbers had simply passed by him the way they passed by everyone else for over a year, unremarked, unquestioned, absorbed into the comfortable assumption that family doesn't lie to family. There's a particular kind of test most people never face, one that doesn't announce itself in advance. It doesn't come as a dramatic choice between obvious good and obvious evil. It comes disguised as an ordinary Tuesday, as a flagged account you almost don't bother opening, as a shrink-wrap invoice you could just as easily dismiss as a clerical error. The test isn't whether you're a good person in the abstract. It's whether you're willing to keep being a good person once the cost of it has a name you love, a face you grew up with, a father who taught you to ride a bike. Most people like to believe they already know what they'd do in Marcus's position. Very few of them have ever actually had to find out. Marcus Whitfield still works in compliance today, at a different institution, in a different city. He rebuilt a version of his life around the same principle he'd always believed in, tested now in a way theory can never quite prepare you for. He speaks to his mother occasionally. He has not spoken to his father since the sentencing. His relationship with Daniel remains, in his own words, a work in progress, complicated by things that may never fully heal. He doesn't regret what he did. He is simply no longer under the illusion that doing the right thing means walking away unscathed. Some choices don't have a clean outcome waiting on the other side of them. They only have the knowledge that you looked directly at the truth when it would have been so much easier to look away, and you didn't flinch. If you were in his position, staring at numbers that told a story your family never wanted told, what would you have done? Would loyalty have won, or would the truth? Some people spend their whole lives never finding out which one they actually are. Marcus Whitfield found out on an ordinary Tuesday, and it changed him permanently. If this story affected you, subscribe for more true stories that ask harder questions than most people are willing to answer. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. There's a strange comfort, and a strange discomfort, in stories like this one. Comfort, because most of us will never be tested this precisely, this personally. Discomfort, because the test doesn't care whether you're ready for it. It simply arrives, disguised as something small, and waits to see what you're actually made of underneath everything you've told yourself about who you are. Marcus didn't choose to become the man who exposed his own family. He simply refused to become the man who could have stopped it and didn't. Somewhere between those two sentences is the entire weight of what integrity actually costs when it stops being a word on a corporate poster and starts being a decision made alone, at a kitchen table, at 2 in the morning, with nowhere left to look but directly at the truth.